Okay, this recording is going to be an audio outline of my book. Uh, this is not going to be an easy book to write in terms of its structure. There are certain sections of it which I guess I must start to delineate. Uh, yeah, I mean, this book is going to sit uneasily with itself because it's going to want to be sort of all things to all people, and it's going to fall short in a major, or it's going to displease people in each category, as it were. Um, when I even think about what to title this book, it unhinges me in some sense, because I can just imagine how the mixture of topics that I'm bringing together becomes unpalatable uh, to each uh, audience that the book might appeal. So it certainly has theological comment or commentary. Um, I believe it has major psychological importance and significance in perhaps producing a reformation of psychology as a field, and perhaps for the first time is actually properly um, creating an edifice for a psychology. There are philosophical and metaphysical uh, products which are part and parcel of that. And so, there are many sort of just intellectual subjects which I'm I sort of want to address at the same time as presenting my psychology, and in some sense, that is a kind of almost also a comment on culture itself. Then an intellectual culture, let's say, and then there is a cultural commentary which I want to make directly at looking at psychology within societies, within cultures, within civilizations, perhaps within the realm of politics and ideology. And, those could be roughly called my opinion on morality. And so there's a kind of, there's a moral discourse, which I guess you could also call it adjunct to my commentary on philosophical matters. Um, and these perhaps also can be traced to some of my theological positions and dispositions. And so let me think if there's anything else. So yeah, there's a kind of sociology um, which I won't be sort of trying to anchor a whole sociological perspective. Maybe I might achieve that, but I will be certainly offer some insights as to the proper place of psychology within sociology, and essentially perhaps some general critiques on how uh, sociology and sociological perspectives can be opaque and obtuse, and how some of them are also morally bankrupt in their formulations. And also how, I guess, sociology needs to be morally um, uh, or and ethically grounded, in order for it not to bear sort of poisonous fruit. So I guess that would generally be a kind of critique, which I kind of is very similar to my critique of, will be very sort of part of the same kinds of critiques that I'll make in the realm of sort of politics and ideology, and perhaps culture as well. So it'll be kind of my informed psychology leading me to have particular opinions in these realms. Of politics, and culture, and morality. And one of the problems is that my work is incredibly detailed. It's incredibly precise. It has a lot to say about important matters of psychology and personality, um, of modeling these things, and also offering. I haven't precisely synthesized a way to alter people's personalities. I think that uh, I have, I think, mostly workable sort of suggestions, um, and so some of these things might need sort of refinement, but essentially the purpose of my work will be to create a treatise that is capable of being, let's say, a catalyst or a precursor to the reformation of psychology, and it might achieve a very structured outline of such, but it will fall short in not having um, tested methods. But I wish to show my research and to show my thoughts on my research, so that other people, perhaps clinicians, having digested my work, uh, would perhaps be able to write their own books, and confirming um, the suggestions and the claims that I make, um, and perhaps validating some of my models, um, and producing their own commentary and perhaps their own, because there will be dynamisms, there will be mechanisms, um, which I might generally suggest at and vaguely point at, but which it will be impossible for me to discover because of essentially the fact that my models are are so precise. Each type of personality would require their own literature, would require their own exposition to sort of outline all of their particular niches, and there might be interesting parallels between certain types. There might be special relationships between certain types that have sort of culturally idiosyncratic sort of features, and certainly I probably won't outline all the psychopathologies um, that exist, although generally I think that there is an experience within psychology of data that has gone unprocessed or at least misunderstood, um, although vague uh, uh, semblances of understanding might be extracted from them, from surveys of, sort of collecting observations from people with similar presentations, or at least from psychopathologies that seem to be related in some form or another. But I predict that my work will make a true psychology possible because of um, delineating all the component constituent parts of a person's psychology. And with that insight intact, uh, it would then become entirely possible to evaluate and to monitor inside of people uh, what is impinging on what, and what the, let's say, in case of psychopathology, what the general breakdown, what the anatomy of such a breakdown um, entails. Um, so the only thing that I lack in some sense is uh, general experience and exposure um, to making more correlations to my research. Anyway, so I will leave that component to others, and I will make it my work to espouse my research in such a way, and to point at correlations, so that people can be educated and understand my models, which I think are, there is nothing that is even vaguely comparable to the level of depth and precision in describing the internal anatomy of someone's psychology. Um, and so they will offer incredibly valuable tools for self actualization and self knowledge. Um, I should also say that what is a little bit unfinished within the research is exactly a methodology to change the personality. And I do see it as a necessary thing to be able to extricate the true being, or whatever you want to call it, from the personality uh, type which I describe. So my psychology does give you, let's say, an idealized model of cognition, which is in some sense being supplanted or displaced, or trampled on by a pattern, by a complex, by a structure that is contorting and subverting, let's say, the idealized, non-pathological model of cognition. I generally call this the 17 model, just to reference it when I'm talking about it. Um, and in some sense, uh, I have a great lot of thinking about the structure of what I call the false ego complex, which is in some sense installed and subverts the 17 model within a particular individual. And I do at least understand ontologically, I believe, the order of development, the procession of development that develops that complex. But it's not so obvious how that complex can be discharged, how it can be retreated from, how it can be packed up or dissolved or rectified or rehabilitated. I So, when I'm talking about therapeutic intervention in terms of the treatment of the false ego complex itself, um, that stands as a pretty separate subject to what else I might say about psychopathologies, because I do think that there is, in some sense, two, uh, at least within my theory, it seems to me at this point, at this juncture, looking at it, there are perhaps two models that you can sort of try to achieve an ordinary false ego complex, um, or a false ego complex that is not um, impinging on itself, does not have any sort of great internal schism according to its own functioning. And then you have the problem of the false ego complex itself. And this is problematic because, in some sense, I think that there is no healthy false ego complex on some level. I think that it is important to develop the false ego complex properly, because if it does not mature properly or develop properly, it will not be in such a state so as to facilitate its extrication from it. That it cannot be let go of. It must be developed. It must be grown into a certain state that it's capable of sacrificing itself, as it were. Anyway, and I link this to inspiration that I have taken from the Christian doctrine, um, or at least my understanding of the Christian doctrine, which I find tremendous correspondence with, in terms of the discoveries and the structures from my research. Um, okay, so mindful of the different audiences that I might attract, or that I might be appealing to uh, with this book, and as I say, I believe that I'm going to be letting everyone down. I'm going to be letting uh, the Christians down, but I've never really considered myself to have the same type of belief, the same type of religion that most people self-identifying as Christian have. Um, I really find a lot of the things that is in their head to be quite a negative or pathological thing that I would correspond to my understanding of how the false ego complex operates. Um, I'm going to let down sort of the secular psychology sorts, except for maybe some section of the Jungians who are capable of tolerating. It's strange. I mean, Jung himself, I think, was almost a student um, of the mystery schools, and perhaps even of the Christian variety of mystery school, his own prophecies essentially, I think, have a stark Christian archetypal um, theme to them. But as far as I can tell, modern Jungians uh, are very loath to be associated with anything um, that might have a connotation of the patriarchy, for want of a better word. But I guess in some sense, I would deride those Jungians as not really living up to the sophistication of thought that Jung represents. But anyway, perhaps some of them might tolerate my work for long enough to explore the theology that I outline. Um, Although I'm not a direct student of Jung, I have profited from his work greatly. Um, not not a great volume of his work, uh, but specifically on his work on alchemy. Essentially, a large section of the development of my research uh, was an extrapolation of one of Jung's reception of the kind of the Platonic model, which in some sense I believe was his was this the alchemical elemental um, let's say reconstitution of consciousness was probably the model that which led to Jung producing the cognitive functions. And Myers-Briggs type personality indicator, the typology community, if nothing more, it must be understood why typology is so powerful and so popular. The reason why typology reaches the rank of a spiritual school, in some sense, is because of the cognitive functions. And let me just quickly explain the magic of the cognitive functions. When you have a set of constituents that amount to a complete rendering of your conscious experiences and cognitions and how you relate to reality, if those can all be um, compiled into a complete set, um, then what you do is you have a complete instrument, you have a complete way of knowing. You have at least a proto uh, knowledge of everything. The question is just how much are you willing to seek in order to make the requisite, let's say, sophisticated mapping of the terrain. How many correlations are you willing to make? How many, but essentially because you've got a full palette of colors, uh, you can then use that to proffer a description and an explanation of everything. Or it becomes an explanation to the extent to which that you can believe that those cognitive functions are a complete set. And so then essentially the problem is never that you don't have an extra cognitive function. The problem is that you haven't deciphered, you haven't discerned deep enough how these issues are interrelated, how these cognitive functions relate to one another. So you can essentially, the onus is on you to do more work, but in some sense that work is at hand. That work is right before you uh, to work out and to do something with. This precludes nihilism. This precludes sort of resting on and leaning on your understanding and having a kind of an external locus of control and living in a narrative, which I would link scripturally to the God of the world and all these bad things. Which the God of the world is a title that the scripture gives to the spirit of man, to Satan is the God of the world. Um, anyway, the world is not the same thing as the earth and the heavens. Uh, anyway, I'm not going to start riffing off about Christian doctrine, although I could at this juncture. But so this is what elevates typology, generally speaking, to the rank of a spiritual understanding, or at least a potential spiritual path. And this is what has been lost in even religion, sadly, to a large degree. But there is, I think, a potential spiritual community within typology. And this is why people will even jokingly say, well, you know, if you believe in Myers-Briggs, it's like a religion, it's like a cult. And I agree. And I think that the reason why it's like that is because it is somewhat of a spiritual path. And people are conspicuous in how they understand and treat spirituality. It's a wonderful aggregation of their metaphysical compass, of their um, in terms of how people understand the cognitive functions, in terms of how they philosophize about them, how they treat the different parts of them, how their particular opinion on each of the cognitive functions. You can extrapolate from that a whole metaphysical um, disposition. I mean, these are people that are essentially communicating nuanced um, metaphysical stances on how they discern their conscious experiences in terms of how they structure their phenomenology. So, anyway, I just wanted to give that ode to cognitive functions and to typology, saying that as far as I can see, it is uh, one of the purest spiritual pursuits in contemporary culture, because it is actively about cultivating discerning in some sense, and people are at least honest about their. It's not even about honesty, it's that the field itself produces a transparency in terms of one's proclivities, and I would even call them spiritual proclivities and their spiritual um, constitution. Anyway, uh, so I say that. Now, this is why psychology has always been so envious of typology and why they precipitated the Big Five, because they saw Myers-Briggs, they saw MBTI, and they were, uh, let's say, both afraid or fearful rather, but also envious. And let me tell you why the Big Five doesn't work. Um, I mean, I'm sure that they can have wonderful. I mean, I believe it's not actually, it's not replicable. If you try to replicate any, there are some metrics within the Big Five which are more replicable than others, but it's hardly replicable. The the degree to which it's replicated is um, it's embarrassing, uh, within the scientific field. Not that I take the scientific field in high regard, in general, because especially in terms of psychology and in terms of the mind, um, you really have to have a robust philosophical handle on what it is that the methodology of science uh, uh, does and how it operates, and you just know that it's in the wrong place. That essentially psychology needs to be a, a department, perhaps even quite a substantive department within the realm of philosophy. We need to understand that science is also grounded in philosophy at some point, and because there is no cogent and coherent philosophical account of what science is doing, other than slapping on the label empiricism, and science is not even empirical. Um, well, it's certainly not empirical about the concept of time, which it has to presume so much about in order just to have a workable methodology, which then, when it absorbs the label of empiricism, means that time, the actual you cannot scientifically discover anything about time, because time has already been presumed to be a certain way in order to have predictive falsification. So and I would say that science has roughly debunked itself when it discovered that the universe is probabilistic and not deterministic. That kind of threw everything out the window in terms of its philosophical uh, edifice. So yeah, so what I was going to say is basically we have to understand that psychology needs to actually be the queen of the sciences in some sense, and and this needs to come from, let's say, some kind of coherent structure that is modeled within philosophy. And I would just generally say that the relationship between psychology and philosophy is that the epistemology uh, in philosophy is going to be the ontology of psychology. And if we don't get that right, there is essentially having to be bullied by this disgusting cult, which is really pseudo intellectual, that the idea, and I can even describe it within cognitive functions very clearly, uh, that there's a kind of introverted thinking that the universe runs on. And you just have to kind of presume this matrix, of this unimatrix, that there's the source code of introverted thinking that runs everything. And the idea is almost that it's always beyond the veil, or rather that it's contained within the veil of a kind of impenetrable ignorance, uh, which kind of is a symbolic assertion of the authority of the unimatrix and the source code. And so it kind of, it's like an unknowable authority. It's an unknowable God in some sense. It's, I would even say it has formulaic resemblances to, the kind of blind faith which is accused against the religious figures. So it's strange that science essentially has its own, or scientism has its own sort of unknowable God in some sense, in order to complete the narrative and to maintain its completeness in its kind of irreconcilable sort of diminution of the understanding, that you just need to understand that you can't understand. It's sort of, and that's the end of the story. And if you don't call that loving the darkness, I don't know what you might. think that scriptural phrase might relate to. Anyway, I have spoken ad nauseum on this kind of topic, so I'm just going to leave that there. Although I really could go on. Yeah, this is yeah. I don't want to repeat too much, and this is just supposed to be an outline. But uh, yeah, the original scientific language was much more honest when they talked about regularities instead of laws of nature. They weren't as hubristic as to assert that um, they were finding these rigid puzzle pieces of this TI unimatrix. And this is essentially a misuse of logic. It's a misuse of thinking about what logic is and what introverted thinking is, which is sometimes often associated with logic. But essentially, introverted thinking does not tell you what is right and what is wrong. Introverted thinking tells you what is self consistent and what is not self consistent. And when you understand that great distinction, which is also makes introverted thinking then is quite distinct and different in quality from introverted feeling, because introverted feeling actually does tell you what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, perhaps. Uh, but introverted feeling does not tell you what is correct and what is incorrect. It only tells you that yes, this is self consistent. So the TI, let's say, verification is always contextually bound. You could, and when I say that, it starts thinking, oh yeah, science. That is kind of it sounds like something to do with science, because science always cares about that it's never verification, it's always falsification. So it's always contextually bound, but somehow let's just believe that the context of science is the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate test, the ultimate uh, uh, perspective somehow. Because if we don't have that kind of canonical oversight and overview of everything, then we have nothing which that can sort of force us into compliance with it, with that authority. And so it's almost like an idolatry of an external authority. But anyway, that although and essentially then discerning itself gets derogated, gets derided as being incapable and not up for the task, and that, well, reality is just something that is beyond human understanding. And what actually becomes the end of that line of thinking is that, well, actually, we need to produce a kind of artificial intelligence that can tell us that it understands science and that we cannot because we are inferior. And so, you're basically moving towards creating sort of a Brainiac from the Superman comic book. Anyway, and I think that Superman as an archetype is quite, um, or at least in terms of Krypton being destroyed, that is the kind of faithlessness that we are, a nihilism, as it were, that is essentially the corruption of a spiritual path or of a spiritual life, of a considered life. Rather than one that is adopted by some dominion, some principality of the air, or some external locus of control and authority. And so you see that this critique also lumps in the Christians who believe in what I would roughly describe as a pagan skyfather. How is that spiritual, that you believe that you're in a story that belongs to some external locus of control? I mean, so in your story, in your picture, there's just a different kind of pantheon. There's a different mythos. Anyway, I'm going to say that the Christian mythos is important because it's like an allegory. It tells you in a low resolution what's happening in some sense, and you need that because to be lectured something, uh, uh, to be taught something that is very complicated, you need a way to break it up into chunks, and you need to say, no, now we're talking about the Trinity, so let's not talk about the crucifixion because that's a different topic. But you have that ability because you have something like a mythos, and that's the purpose of a mystery, is that the mystery shall be finished at some point, and you will be left with an understanding. And that is the whole point of the communion. That is the whole point of spiritual gifts working together to bring about the full stature of the Christ and the singular building of the uh, uh, complete doctrine, that you will not be, Ephesians chapter 4, that you won't be sort of led astray and blown about. Because it is the mind of Christ that is what Jesus Christ is, that is the only begotten Son. And until you can confess that it is come in your flesh, 1 John chapter 4, uh, you know, well then essentially if you think that it should come, well, sadly that means, according to 1 John chapter 4, that's actually the definition of the Antichrist. If you don't believe that he is come in your flesh and you believe that he should come, anyway, so as we see, most people are in fact antichrists, but this is not a high accusation. This is just, let's say, the natural spiritual condition until it is displaced by a real spiritual teaching and understanding that cuts away the death uh, of the darkness of ignorance and not understanding. Anyway, so I guess that's the sort of Christian sort of thing. So anyway, I was just talking about psychology. So the point is that the big five is bad because um, you're not going to achieve it by incremental steps. You have to achieve it from a very sophisticated theoretical framework that is going to have some kind of independent philosophical justification for itself. You're going to have to model a deep theory of mind out of philosophy, and then you're going to have to work from that into a typology. You're not going to be able to psychometrically piece together um, features because you have no idea at the kinds of structures that might be producing those features. The idea that you're going to kind of, from the outside, uh, uh, gain raw data that's going to allow you to model the inside without a already some kind of theoretical rubric or metric is to be led by the flesh, I'll just say. But it is essentially to already start from not having an understanding. And I'm afraid that, when is that inspiration going to come that's going to give you the confidence to try to have an understanding? Well, it doesn't happen in science because there's no verification, there's only falsification. Uh, and even if you had the real truth, you would never, in some sense, know it, except if you kind of believe in the whole sort of tunnel reality of science that, well, we can be highly confident in this. So confidence is becomes a weird kind of nihilistic displacement of truth, um, that at the same time has this sort of denigration built into it, a kind of existential denigration of consciousness and the self. Um, anyway, and what I'm basically tracing is why there are all these sort of abjectly profane sets of beliefs that spring up. I mean, there are lots of things. I mean, there are things like this that exist just in the realm of morality. I keep on bringing up this example, but essentially, the reason why vegetarianism and veganism breeds the same kind of weird sort of hubris, but also uh, moral nihilism, is because why okay, let me just posit this at the outset that I don't include people who believe in reincarnation, because people who have, let's say, a whole mythological story as to why animals have maybe like a future moral faculty, because essentially they're not humans yet, but they might be humans in the future or something. I'm not commenting on that. I'm not saying that that is moral nihilism. I think beliefs about reincarnation don't apply to the critique that I'm currently making. But essentially, people that believe that animals have the same moral standing as humans, these are people that don't know or understand what is morally significant about humans. So they don't distinguish between, well, I mean, I'll just say what the concepts are, but they don't privilege sentience. They don't say, well, it's important if something is sentient or something isn't sentient. And human beings are sentient because we can have free will. Not every human being has free will, but all sentient beings can have the potential, have the possibility of exercising free will. That doesn't mean that they will, but that means that they have the capability. So if we have free will, or we can have free will, and that makes us morally significant, and that means that special moral consideration needs to be granted to our existence. Okay, I would almost call that the default position. But if you want to say, well, animals aren't sentient, but we should treat them as if they are sentient, then what makes sentience important if it all amounts to the same effect? So either you say that you hold the distinction, but that the distinction comes to no effect, which I would say is a kind of, it's a self-defeating property in some sense. It's like, well, this having this set belief is sort of more, again, I've made in my last recording probably that I spoke about, I talked about this, and I don't want to repeat it, but essentially, so either people concede that animals don't have the same moral significance, but we should just treat them like they have a higher significance than they do, because that would be good for us in some sense to lose the enacted, actualized uh, elevation of the moral significance uh, uh, of sentient life, of human beings above um, animals. I should probably just explain that. So the reason why animals aren't sentient, obviously, it looks like that they do what they want to do in some sense, but the thing is that that's an I can't say this word, anthropomorphization. because they don't want anything. You could say that they have a drive, they have an instinct, but they don't want anything because they don't have concepts, they don't have an understanding. So if you don't have a concept and you can't relate concepts to other concepts, uh, which is what an understanding is you know the interrelatedness between mental objects that have properties and attributes which you track, um, so that you're capable of acting according to an understanding. Animals don't do that. They can, in some sense, they might even be able to, in a quite sophisticated way, they can almost replicate that from the outside, but they don't have concepts and they can't form an understanding. And that's a direct sequitur. They can't form an understanding because they don't have mental objects and concepts. So the so I mean, I guess the tricky, interesting thing here is that you can, in some sense, you can project rationalizations onto animals. You can sort of deconstruct their behavior and say, well, there's a rational, algorithmic, sort of computation, um, that was sort of heuristically embodied by the animal. The point is that um, that is not to say that instincts don't develop some kind of heuristic self-organizing apparatus in terms of how they outwardly relate to other objects. But the only reason why we can even sort of anthropomorphize that as a kind of as a form of intelligence is because we have intelligence and we are ascribing um, conceptual translations of their behavior. And because we have conceptual models of things, which essentially are understandings, uh, we can make decisions. Now, those decisions might not be characteristic of free will because we could just merely be echoing uh, essentially, we could be slavishly um, following a kind of a heuristic which we have decided to allow to be imprinted upon us. So essentially, our free will can become dormant, but it doesn't. Free will is not the difference between humans and animals. It's sentience is that we have always the capability of returning to our free will after surrendering it in some sense. But anyway, that that are issues that I go into when I talk about my deep theory of mind and when I talk about my philosophical structure of cognition, and then when I actually specifically talk about the actual models of personality, um, and the aspects of personality, more complicated themes arise as well because then um, we can see the challenges in development, and also the kind of the special challenges which are generated from um, perhaps the development of different kinds of personality styles and the influence of culture, um, and essentially kinds of I don't know how to describe this. I would say, almost say the outsourcing of an internal locus of control, because you can inculcate within the false ego complex a very high degree of an internal locus of control, which is down the line of a kind of fundamental self deception and self delusion, uh, where essentially you've allowed yourself to be adopted by the God of the world, but under the tutelage of the spirit of man, the God of the world, one um, is inculcating a form of development in that uh, as a sort of as a child of the world, as it were. But I believe that you can reach a point of development which is aware of its own depravity, that develops in such a fine way that you uncover your own iniquity within yourself in some sense, and essentially the reckoning with sin, with one's own sin, and the anyway, I've got a specific concept that I call perfecting the vanity, which I think is the only way to essentially uncover the slavish impetus and that one renders to the lust. Um, and once you start being aware of the lust and understanding how the lust eventually, via the vanity, leads to the trial and to the sin eventually, um, one can start to pack up the lust. One can cease it. It's possible to let it go, as it were. And then, when you are letting go of the lust, you can be left with essentially the start of the whole process, which is sort of uncovering the superego, uncovering the false prophet and the God of the world, um, which I haven't exactly worked out yet. I think that maybe you should also try to perfect the vanity of the superego. Um, anyway, and try to rehabilitate the cognition that was given over to this fictitious entity, because the false prophet, in some sense, is is an invention. It's almost like the invention of an imaginary friend, which you created in order to represent your experience of you gave away a piece of your soul in order to make an idolatry of the God of the world, in order to represent to you an avatar of the God of the world, so that you could have something in your head that you could say, why is this happening to me? And you could have something to address that you could fictitiously believe was delivering to you your conscious experience. And so it was a way for you to know a false God. And in some sense, yeah, maybe I need to clean up some of, because in some sense I've called this cognition that you give up in this sense, I've called that the false prophet, but I've also associated it with the God of the world. But the God of the world is not mentioned in Revelations, or unless you believe the correlation that I've just made, that the false prophet is thematically quite similar to the God of the world. Um, anyway, so yeah, I mean, and the whole, well, at least in Revelations, it's described that the false prophet is eventually placed in the lake of fire. And in some sense, I think that the lake of fire might be the vanity in the superego, essentially. That if you can rehabilitate that cognition, that cognition will swallow up or dissolve or confine and hold captive uh, the false prophet, and then allowing you to access the cognition that the false prophet used to inhabit, and essentially rehabilitate that, and then sort of from that step onward would perhaps allow you to extricate yourself from the entanglement of the rest of the structures in the false ego complex. Because even one might be able to conceptually disassociate from the lust, there will be a lot of habits, there will be a lot of patterns that one will have to essentially almost rewire, or to sort of yeah, and I think even being able to rewire the false ego complex does mean that you have to have a very good understanding of how it actually operates, and how it internally impinges on itself and things like that. So I do think that it is something that you do have to become familiar with before you try to pack up the whole thing, because otherwise you don't know what you are distancing yourself from. You can't just kind of blindly walk away from it. You have to kind of have your eyes open to the enemy. Okay, so anyway, I'm really talking all over the place. Okay, I guess that'll be enough for this recording. I'm not going to introduce this topic properly or thoroughly, because I have recordings that I have recently made that specifically delve into these topics, ones that talk about sort of the cultural wasteland, and the cultural collapse and things like that. But the psychological element of this is quite interesting. Also, in terms of the recordings that I made that talk about the structure of metatype. So the general sort of cultural deterioration that we have, which in some sense I think operates because the current cultural hegemon and the current sort of popular ideology is to essentially displace normative values and normative principles and ethics, with replacing normative ethics with a narrative. And then in that narrative, you kind of have a moral picture of some outcome, and then the means are justified by the ends, which are represented by the moral picture. And so you just have to work out what moral dicta sort of formulaically prescribe the path to that outcome, of that moral picture. And then essentially you're committed to the method, and you're in a closed mode, and thus you're also quite pliable to whoever is puppeteering the narrative. And essentially, virtue signaling, in some sense, I think, has to do with facilitating the precipitation of that moral outcome, of the moral picture. And because it's a non-normative ethical system, uh, it's very easy to contrive compliance just by contextualizing reality, um, by selectively framing it in order to produce, let's say, the latest moral dicta, the latest update. And so it's kind of like a mob justice mentality, or a mob mentality, that culture gets infused with, and it's obsessed with this kind of radical adherence to placating the issue that the narrative sort of uh, is anchored by. Because also another thing about these moral narratives that aren't normative is that there is no positive ideal, there is no positive standard. It's always a negative standard. It's always a complaint. It's always a blanket accusation of a systemic deficit. And so people are conditioned by the systemic deficit, and therefore it's all about reaction and opposition to this prime evil, the removal of which then arrives, delivers you to the outcome in the moral picture. So once you have that kind of worldview, um, the most important thing is essentially being conducted by the virtue signal that facilitates the precipitation of the moral picture, and the outcome, and then that, which essentially implies also of having a kind of these weird principles which are almost anti-values and anti-principles, because they're all principles of expediency, of, let's say, tending to the moral panic and the moral emergency that the moral picture is sort of uh, uh, emphasizing and focusing on it, and because it is centered around that. So it's centered around the negative injustice. It doesn't have a positive value system of positive. So anyway, I was thinking a general solution to this, and I've spoken about this in my recent recordings, is that we need a kind of a values constitution as a moral movement, as not something that's going to be institutionalized in any sort of public institution, but in terms of just a kind of some kind, because just as even an example of how normative value systems are structured, because you don't have to believe in a particular one. There isn't just a single particular one, but I would tend to think that most viable ones are going to have some features that are shared, that they have to be grounded in, a kind of the sovereign individual, the conscientious, a kind of classically liberal in a lot of its treatments of things. Because if you don't have those things, then you have no way to conserve a normative system that doesn't just sort of automatically get taken over by a kind of orthodoxy and abject um, uh, sort of if you don't bootstrap moral responsibility on the individual, if that isn't one of your core axioms, moral responsibility that is burdened by the individual, um, and therefore essentially the almost a correlating feature to moral responsibility is uh, agency, is a kind of is the value and the integrity and the potential self-confidence from navigating a worldview in which you are an agent. Um, and so, without the one, you lose the other. And so, the lack of agency is also, I think, a symptom of the lack of normative values and a normative ethical framework. This is what has made culture essentially a wasteland as well. But anyway, so having a kind of cultural movement, something that would have perhaps an emblem, an insignia attached to it, something that business owners could say, these are our values. And so it's already nicely articulated all these general principles, and then how these principles are how they would function in practice, and almost you would have to create this treatise as a kind of cultural settlement, anticipating that, of the kind of slander and the kind of accusations which would be levied against it. And in some sense, it's not there to convince or convert the people who would have an alternative vision. It's just to say, no, these are my values, tolerate them, please. Or at least, if you come work for this company, you don't have to agree to these values, but you have to agree to tolerate them and not to actively subvert them while you are in the culture of this business, because these are the values uh, that this institution has regard for, and this is how we're going to run our HR department and things like that. And so people can use it as a way to navigate and to find people who that they don't have to then personally vet people all the time to work out how much of the toxic let's say, alternative worldview, the non-normative morality that they have imbibed, you can just say, do you agree with this? Or at least do you agree not to subvert, not to openly, directly subvert these values? Can you at least agree to tolerate them, um, and not to sort of puncture people's world view because this is what they positively value and what they positively believe in, and they don't want to have agitation. They don't want to have accusations levied against them until you can actually at least have a competent disagreement with those positive values, and so you've kind of got it's meant to be a kind of a fence. It's meant to be a sort of a shield. So then at least a cultural settlement might also become possible in the future, because you'll actually have something. Because right now it's just avoiding the blanket accusations and the labeling, and quite frankly the screeching from the anti-racist worldview, if you even want to give them that epithet. Um, that because essentially uh, we can't just essentially keep on dodging their accusations and taking sort of their slings and arrows as they push the line forward and eat up all the institutional integrity as they sort of corrupt it into their non-normative moral system. At least then there can be a hill to die on, and or perhaps that could also be used as a kind of as a legal argument at some point, that, well, these are our positive values, this is common sense, um, anyone can hold these values, and if we don't follow these values, then we actually, all we end up doing is virtue signaling and corrupting and destabilizing how anything can even hope to function in a common decent society with commonly held values. That gives us the transparency to be able to um, identify what's actually going wrong and what doesn't add up, so that that can be given proper attention, rather than essentially creating all this noise and destabilization of a meritocracy as you kind of lean into this weird kind of bigotry and double standards and hypocrisy, which is all hedged on this kind of systemic guilt and systemic accusations, essentially, of a kind of moral deficit, which is toxic and poisonous to normative values and a normative ethical system. Um, anyway, okay, I've had to say that all over that stuff again, but what I want to get to is talk about how this manifests in psychology. So there I've just kind of given a bit of a moral treatment of this issue, but I'd like to give a kind of in some sense, I would think such a memorandum, such a values-based constitution as a cultural movement would be just also very useful, because then you can kind of work out which people are are safe to trust. Not that you could automatically trust them, but essentially they have at least fulfilled some necessary condition. Because someone with a non-normative morality, I mean, it's actually very hard to even have a discussion with them on anything, because they have almost like a bad faith built into their worldview. Because if as long as they can get away with labeling you with something according to their narrative, which they don't have to substantiate their narrative, they just presume that it's true and that you haven't heard about it, and that you have some kind of intellectual deficit for not already being marked by their conditioning, as it were, of the world situation as they have received it. I think there's a huge analogy here with the mark of the beast. But anyway, I don't have to sort of inject religiosity into this kind of moral rebuke that I would levy against them, and what is essentially kind of nihilism. But I think psychologically how this nihilism develops within my models of psychology is it's the unconscious side of the mind. So after the subconscious has developed, one of the hardest transitions, I think, in development, which we're kind of having a cultural schism around, is the development from the subconscious to the unconscious. Um, and more people are having difficulty making that transition. And I've linked this to ADHD as well. I think that uh, there is a reticence now, which has been, I think, sort of impregnated into the culture, that all the sides of the mind should be equivalent to the subconscious, that your individual naive inclinations and preferences, your innate feelings about things, your knee-jerk sort of inclination about something, that all the other sides of the mind should just facilitate and emphasize and magnify that. And so they already treat the unconscious side of the mind just like the subconscious, that it should just essentially be a narrative that, again, magnifies the subconscious preferences. They're not willing to objectify the subconscious within the unconscious paradigm, which is, I generally thematically relate the unconscious to morality itself, because you're objectifying yourself, your preferences in the third person. So you're almost creating a contemplative, retrospective um, reduction of your internal preferences. So you're commenting on your preferences from a third person perspective, from a kind of an abstracted perch, And I think this is also so you're imagining how you seem from a third person perspective. You're modeling yourself from a society point of view in some sense. Um, I guess you could also call that a narrative as well. You're what is the story that your personal preferences are going through? So you're tracking your personal preferences as a story, as a kind of as looking at yourself from beyond yourself. Um, and so I think that the proper development of this would be something like normative morality, because if you have normative morality, you can seamlessly make this transition between the subconscious and the unconscious and develop the unconscious properly. Um, and then you can progress from the unconscious to the ego. Um, Sorry, let me just say this, because this is not, you'd have to look at my other recordings if this is the only recording that you're listening to, is that uh, the first thing that develops in some sense is the superego, but it's almost not worth talking about because it's really quite different from all the other sides of the mind, and it only half of the superego actually develops from the start, and it kind of, in some sense, that's an environmental sort of unconscious shadow, is what the superego is. And you only sort of relate to the superego directly when you haven't developed any of the other sides of the mind. And so you're actually talking to a part of yourself that you are taking to be an avatar of your environment. So you're sort of communing with essentially an avatar of sort of the god of your environment. So you have this personal connection to something that is delivering to you your experience of reality. And you have to take a part of your own cognition in order to build that representation of that environment. And so you're kind of creating a form of idolatry in some sense, um, that is responsible for delivering to you your experience of the outside world. And so, you have a way to self soothe then, because if anything is anxious, you have something in your mind which you can sort of propitiate, that you can be in communication with. But it's a bit strange because this communication is somewhat a game. It's somewhat fictitious, because you've created this character, this anthropomorphization, excuse me for not being able to pronounce the word so nicely, of your environment, but you have to build it out of a part of your own um, cognitive stack, essentially. Now, this ends up creating a sort of a cascade. So, um, after you start developing your sides of the mind, that figure blends into the background. So right at the start, you could kind of address it, but then you stop believing it as an imaginary friend, and it just kind of blends into the background. It becomes a kind of fatalism, in some sense. But you kind of start you actually eat up that fatalism, because as the other sides of the mind develop, what you're in some sense doing is you're converting that external locus of control of the superego into a developed internal locus of control, that you are taking an internal responsibility for the experience. So essentially, the more that the other sides of the mind develop, the more that they kind of displace the functioning of the superego. So in some sense, the superego is the negative, and the other sides of the mind are the positive image that is developed from that negative. So anyway, there are more complicated facets of that, but anyway, moving on. So the first thing that develops is the subconscious, which is like your internal preferences, and in some sense, these things directly are gifted from the superego. The superego delivers to the subconscious its first two component parts as a gift in some sense. And so the seed of the subconscious that grows is has almost a kind of a strange mystic. The subconscious is strangely sort of in this. It's in this dream. It's in this mystery that, because its own origin is somewhat weirdly connected to this, the source of its experience, the superego. But anyway, so really, the transition between the subconscious and the unconscious is the most important stage of development, because as soon as you start working out, let's say, structures and rules between the positive sides of the mind, between the subconscious and the contingent or the burgeoning unconscious, is really going to lay down the framework for how the positive sides of the mind relate to the subconscious. And in some sense, what has been, I would say, in this current cultural hegemony that we are sadly subjected to, we have very unhealthy unconscious sides of the mind in the current, in generally speaking, in the younger generation within the current population. These are people who don't believe in having an internal locus of control. They believe that the system is, they don't have the confidence to. This is a bit of a catch-22. They don't have the confidence to have a normative value system, because the ideology of the narrative of being controlled by the system, and having to deal with these thematic, almost cosmological, existential. They've created a mythos. They've created a mythologized existence instead of inculcating an internal locus of control. So, and this has many different sort of styles attached to it, and many different manifestations and permutations of this kind of corruption. And I think there are many different species of psychopathology which roughly amount to this, but are manifested differently because people are doing this with different, let's say, cognitive anatomy. And there are also some important, let's say, species, because there are, there are things that, so in some sense, you can just have an undeveloped unconscious. You can have an immature unconscious, or a kind of arrested development. But then there are things that are even, let's say, more pernicious in terms of unconscious sides of the mind that are actively alloyed and allied to feeding the superego some kind of continued role. So it's kind of like the unconscious is colluding in and continuing on what is generally a theme that the subconscious has already tried to concoct, a strange kind of pact with the superego, because in some sense you can have a very stable form of sort of solipsism between the subconscious and the superego. Between the two, they can complete each other in a really a very toxic form of autism, or also solipsism. You could describe it in a lot of different ways, but and when the unconscious is involved in this, I mean, and if the unconscious and the ego is also involved with this, I would generally call it perhaps something that would probably be on the spectrum of borderline personality disorder. And I generally like to describe what I would call quite a varied spectrum of histrionic disorder. I think that there are a whole slew of people which essentially don't go diagnosed as having personality disorders, because essentially their manifestation of what I would generally regard as a kind of histrionic disorder doesn't happen on the metric of, let's say, kind of projecting intimacy onto people and projecting weird connotations and sort of a weird kind of, um, let's say, romantic compatriotism and sympathy that is kind of um, connecting with their strange, let's say, emotional sort of introjective projection. But their introject. I would just generally. I don't like saying introject and projection. I like saying introjective paradigm. And so if you move to a model of that, that histrionics essentially, just like borderlines, have an introjective paradigm, and they have, let's say, a particular mechanism, or borderlines have a strategy of incepting people into their introjective paradigm. Histrionics, in some sense, are more like true believers in some sense, um, or they're very slow borderlines. They don't switch around the game like borderlines in some sense. They know that they're orchestrating a strategy because they apply the same formula with many different uh, uh, methods, and they drop one method and they pick up another method, and essentially it all amounts to the same kind of um, unilateral dictation of the narrative. Histrionics, on the other hand, will very slowly migrate their methods to be different, but they will very painstakingly collect a, almost a cultural mechanism. So, I mean, many histrionics are, almost the stereotype is a woman who uses sexuality and uses social conventions around intimacy, and then sort of ends up telling all these crazy stories that, oh, when he was talking to me, he was suggesting all these things, and he secretly communicated to me that we were going to have a long-term relationship. It's that kind of, that's generally what's associated with histrionic. Um, whereas cerebral histrionics, they have an intellectual cosmology in some sense. They have a narrative, almost exactly like what I'm complaining about with the SJW worldview, is that they have a narrative, and they're usually wanting to compel people into some kind of moral prescription or some kind of moral outcome, so that they can kind of lead you down a garden trail, that you agree to some parts of the narrative, and then they've got you clinched. And then often they will use rationalization, they will use sophistry. They know how to kind of dishonestly hook people into their narrative. They know how to um, sort of bait the hook, and also how to kind of play the game of almost how to um, uh, surmount the obstacle or whatever bar there is in terms of conversational conventions of give and take of or something like that. So they will often abuse social dynamics. They will abuse conventions um, in order to play quite a dirty game, quite an intellectually sort of scuffed up, sort of it's almost a kind of tactical sophistry, um, where they are just designing to engineer a certain outcome in which their, let's say, moral narrative as a schema ends up being dominant, ends up being controlling, or ends up in some. It's but it's. I know people would say, well, what you're describing doesn't sound anything like histrionic disorder, but I want to say there is an intimacy involved in this. It's almost it's it's the same kind of obtuse vampirism that histrionics are essentially, that the classical histrionic is extracting, because in some sense there is no real intimacy that the histrionic is actually connecting with, because they are projecting this narrative on and this role in within the narrative onto their participant, and then that's what they're communing with in some sense, that they are feeding off of that um, let's say virtual intimacy and adulation even and sort of connection, which is all just happening in their private imagination. And the cerebral histrionic, I would argue, is in fact doing the exact same thing. They're just doing it in a different facility. They're doing it in a different sphere of operation. They're doing it in a more, let's say, abstract or intellectual realm. Um, and some people can do it with intuition, some people can do it with feeling, some people can do it with logic and rationalization, and also sometimes it's a combination of these things. um, anyway, this is it's interesting as well, because there are also, let's say, toxic social cultures in some sense, where you have many people that have many different kinds of unconscious immaturity that kind of clump together, because they can all feed on the same uh, I mean, people have talked about this within psychological circles for a long time. They call it that you have a kind of that people will attach themselves to narcissists who are what do they even call them now? Sort of failed narcissists, or what are they called? Covert narcissists. That covert narcissists will attach themselves to narcissists as if the narcissist will make the kill, and then the covert narcissist will have an opportunity to extract some form of narcissistic supply, um, sort of hunting in a pack, and it sort of also amounts to the kind of the analogy that is used is flying monkey from the Wizard of Oz, that these people become useful and helpful to essentially the apex predator, that then allows them to um, satiate their sort of uh, sort of operate the mechanisms of their psychopathology. So in the same way, I think that there is a way in which there's a kind of there can be a cultural consensus around what I would generally call a kind of an ideologically hybridized borderline personality disorder, under the umbrella of which, under the aegis of which, many species of cerebral histrionics can effectively have free reign, and I've described this in many of my recordings as saying that there's always the secondary pseudo intellectual economy of people that can use the moral outcome and the moral picture and the non-normative system of ethics in order to kind of give themselves an activity to prove their intellectual credentials, to prove that they can square the circle and to make themselves useful to this collective project of essentially proselytizing this narrative, so they can be field marshals within the armies of these uh, morally corrosive, sort of ideologically parasitic systems that can only anchor themselves in orientation to a scapegoat. Um, the problem is that these things can never exist as cultural hegemons. They can only stably exist as subcultures, because if they ever become the dominant cultural rubric and structure, uh, they decompose the whole substructure. They because they are like locusts. Uh, they need a living host to decompose. I think the vampire metaphor is almost very pertinent. But essentially, yeah. So there's always a kind of a niche for this. I mean, this is these subcultures, these toxic subcultures, have always existed. Um, and perhaps they've even served a function because they could be pointed at as as a kind of moral exemplar of what not to do, because it's essentially it's a kind of it's almost like a tautological self-fulfilling sort of you know it's strange how essentially people who do not have the courage to formulate a normative ethical value system are essentially saying, um, well, I can't make ideals. I'm not worthy to make ideals, and then to keep those ideals pristine and to enact them and actualize them into being. Um, that takes a lot of sort of moral courage. It is almost the definition of virtue. Whereas people that say, no, 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 I can't fulfill my own ideal standards and expect them from myself and from others, because then I would be the locus of sort of responsibility, and the narrative needs to take responsibility for me. I need an external locus of control. Um, so it's a much you know, there's a stark difference in culture between such people, and I've always thought that it was a huge lapse in culture that we didn't actively instruct some kind of moral pedagogy in terms of um, moral instruction. I mean, obviously, in some sense, you cannot force people to adopt a normative moral system, but you should at least perhaps explain that there's essentially the dark path uh, uh, and something that actually has a kind of, in some sense, almost the scriptural metaphor of the fruit with the seed of the fruit bearing tree within itself. That anyway. I mean, I'm getting lost in sort of tangents here, because there are very interesting sort of parallels to make, that that essentially, if you are trying to live within a narrative, in some sense, you are fundamentally conscripted and captive and conditioned and dead. in the context of that picture. And so if you don't have the knowledge of the mechanism that allows you to transcend such a superficial and hollow way of being, um, you end up really becoming a zombie, and you have to sort of uh, find constant you sort of pounds of flesh in order to motivate your existence, because unless your hoard is growing, um, by consuming, by ravenously consuming and assimilating more flesh in some sense, you can't know that your narrative is essentially marching in the right direction. So um, because you really kind of are obsessed with this kind of expedient logistic logistical problem of exercising the virtue signal, which is all essentially orientated towards expanding its influence and control, um, within correctly representing the narrative. And in some sense, because it only has a negative value system, the only way that you can know that you've done that is if you've been able to find a scapegoat to impugn, to kind of to rub their face in it, to kind of to absorb your negative accusation, to find a scapegoat that will represent to you the uh, the moral deficit, so that you can ritualize um, expunging it, expunging the injustice, expunging the evil, because essentially that's all it has to look out for. So essentially, it doesn't have a positive structure, and it doesn't have any principles. It just has uh, success in terms of fulfilling the outcome of the moral picture. Um, anyway, essentially, what I'm also trying to describe is that, I mean, this is just another form of nihilism. And in some sense, at least in the sort of in the social justice warrior anti-racism ideology worldview of this moral picture, at least they at some point can say, well, we're attempting to do the right thing. Our moral picture is really a pretty picture, so please sympathize with us, and just nod your head, and accept your yoke of producing the virtue signal and being part of this. Never mind the cost. Never mind the baby that gets sort of thrown out with the bathwater in producing this virtue signal, and dismantling and destroying normative values and a normative ethical system. Um, you know, uh, and all the double standards and hypocrisy and blanket accusations that are involved uh, with the virtue signal means that you can disguise any amount of plutocracy, elitism. It's sort of because you don't have the normative values anymore that would sort of show you these egregious discrepancies that destroy common standards, and a common humanism gets completely destroyed, um, in order to keep the narrative inflated of the moral picture. Um, you really get disconnected, and you have to disconnect people's humanity in order to say, well, the virtue signal is more important than anything else. So you really end up getting sort of hypnotized and transfixed by that. Sorry, let me find my point again. So I was talking about morality. Oh yeah, psychology, nihilism. So uh, yeah, so I guess I was just going on about the cerebral histrionic in terms of, because, it's weird for them, the cerebral histrionic, in some sense, is a bit of a mercenary. They don't actually care about the narrative or the moral picture, even. It's just a means to an end for them to kind of exercise their proficiency, their sort of rational uh, ability in some sense. So, in some sense, you could say that they are the kind of psychological structure that is, that culture, that cultural blueprint is something that is almost their natural, you know, usually it's only ever been in a subculture that you've had that kind of thing, and then they would have to make themselves relevant within a subculture, and they would compartmentalize this function. I mean, a lot of people can compartmentalize their immaturity. I mean, in a lot of ways, this phenomena always existed within people. It would just be essentially the section of their moral worldview and schema that was embarrassing, irrational, uh, that wasn't very thought out, but they had this strange kind of cognitive bias, because it was sort of important to how they structured their own view of themselves in terms of their own sort of so you could tell that essentially there's a psychological investment with that section of their beliefs, so it's very touchy to them. And I mean, this is also the kind of toxicity that exists within religion, or what I would call false religion, that essentially people have done the exact, I mean, there's no limit to what you can do this with. But in some sense, obviously, in specifically totalitarian cultures, it's not compartmentalized. It gets elevated as the fulcrum of how everything operates. And so, when that moral picture becomes the orthodoxy, becomes the central claim in which, becomes the pivotal nexus that society must be organized around, that um, you get things like the Führer principle, although this kind of, let's say, culture that is leaning into sort of supporting to the maximum cerebral histrionics to have maximum power. They will eventually have to philosophize and rationalize out some kind of Führer principle, and you can really see this in philosophy departments. I mean, this is it's ironic because they use aspects of philosophy which I think are very fertile subject matter, but they have completely corrupted and contorted these concepts. It's weird how they have almost gravitated, some, not all the time, but in at least in philosophy, they do gravitate towards subject matter which are important in morality, because they've had to steal something and corrupt it in order to keep their zombie horde, sort of satiated. Um, but epistemic responsibilism and epistemic injustice. Yeah, I guess epistemic injustice, which is was almost an offshoot of epistemic responsibilism, is a completely corrupt notion in some sense. Well, it's been corrupted. I mean, I can agree that you could have something called epistemic injustice. The problem is that by its very term, by its very conceptual um, grammar and mass, or you can't do anything about epistemic injustice, because if the truth has been destroyed or hurt, there is no compensation that you can make for that. There's no substitution for the truth. So the idea is, well, if you can claim epistemic injustice, then you can just sort of claim that the system needs to be enslaved to you and needs to kind of proffer up to you a kind of epistemic substitution in the form of damaging somebody else's truth in compensation. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's moral barbarism. I mean, it's literally two wrongs make a right. You know, it's. I mean, it's the level of juvenile debauchery that happens, with these highfalutin philosophical terms. I mean, it's frankly, it's unsettling, and essentially, they'll keep on doing this kind of gerrymandering and embarrassing philosophy until they have eventually derived something like the Führer principle, which allows them to kind of escape the kind of the relativism paradox that they're going to judge the system from a relativistic moral pluralism, but beyond the system. That only the Führer can do that, and we need to elect some kind of role within our culture in order to facilitate this necessary component in the ideological worldview, uh, as they kind of complete almost the kind of the pseudo-religious, sort of mythology that is required in order to maintain that moral landscape of the moral picture. Um, and this is what happens when you essentially fully depend on a weird sort of external locus of moral authority. Uh, and then you have to kind of tell a story about how that moral authority, in a very fixed way, relates to sort of categories that uh, can be nicely sort of intellectually armchaired and arbitrated over. Um, okay, perhaps I'm losing my thread slightly, so let me just uh, recap slightly. So I still wanted to elaborate on the nihilism. Did I cover everything that I wanted to cover? So it is interesting because, I mean, look, I know that I've thrown in a lot of elements here and it's a bit confusing, but I would just want to say that essentially the canonical mythology and and sort of the thing that actually will eventually structure the ideological narrative in some sense is, from an archetypal perspective, and this is a very strange thing to say, is kind of like a collective organism that has borderline personality disorder, that is able to sort of selectively construct reality and sort of have a sense of self entitlement and demands, and can sort of unilaterally direct the narrative and into kind of reordering itself and recollecting itself, um, and reconstituting itself by sort of recycling and repurposing, whatever failure that it has, and that essentially it just diverts any pressure. Is that, oh, well, the reason why we got this wrong is because we've just worked out that the conspiracy of false consciousness against us from the scapegoat has meant that we are that we we were misled because of the injustice that was injected by the scapegoat. And so, as long as they have that in their narrative, and essentially that never ends. Even the Nazis, after they had locked up all the Jews, said that our consciousness has been infiltrated. The Jewish conspiracy still lives within us because we've been infiltrated and infected, that our thoughts have been infiltrated. I mean, it's exactly like this white privilege anti-racist ideology. It's the same thing. I mean, in some sense, there's literally no difference between the Nazi philosophy and the social justice warrior philosophy, because the Nazis believed that they were genetically superior, and the social justice warrior people believe that they are morally superior, and that they have even inherited this moral superiority from history. So, what's the difference between inheriting genetic superiority and inheriting moral superiority. I would submit that there is effectively no difference. It's just a slightly different mythology. It's the same formula with different window dressing. Anyway, and cerebral histrionics are in some sense the same, but usually they can compartmentalize their toxicity because they do usually manage it. They will only try to concoct this kind of narrative or this kind of bubble reality if they can sort of they're almost like spiders. They produce a web in some corner, and they want their web to be attached to structured fixtures that aren't going to change. They're not going to adapt or evolve. And then they wait for their prey to come to them. And that's their niche, that's their corner spider web. But now we live essentially in a brave new world in which normative morality has been punctured, been deflated, been supplanted by this pernicious anti-normative moral picture, and this has allowed the creatures of the abyss to issue forth, um, and to take whatever targets they so wish to be captured and tortured. Um, Everyone is vulnerable and prone to them. Uh, and I submit that essentially the only and I must say I'm not opposed to any of this stuff. I mean, I find it deplorable, but I actually find that this is a wonderful opportunity to create a cultural document and to create consciousness that essentially people aren't just going to rely on, let's say, the intelligence of the group, that they actually have to consciously be a counterculture contrarian, that they have to say, no, I'm not going with the crowd because the crowd is immoral. I am I have my values, and I'm going to try to find other people that share my values so that I can have trusting communication and such. That I'm not opposed to people suffering for their wisdom or their beliefs. I mean, if you're not willing to sacrifice for it, then you obviously never valued it in some sense. And I mean, I'm not saying that people should lose their jobs or something like that, or that they shouldn't be intelligent, but I think that people do have to make conscious commitments to what it is that they, um, otherwise, do they really have a moral position? Do they have any kind of moral standing? If they only had such, in the conformity of the herd or the crowd or something like that. Anyway, that aside, yeah, I mean, I think it is correct that this is how people should distinguish themselves. And maybe we'll come out of it more resilient because we'll have a cultural document that, or a cultural settlement that will be hard won. Um, and then we will have essentially a resilience to essentially this kind of pernicious parasitic nihilism. Um, I was going to talk more about psychological features. I was going to talk about how cerebral histrionics, I would say, are very good at modulating their vampirism and their sort of parasitism to specific contextual situations. It's like you can see this very much in terms of on the internet when you're talking to people in rooms, which are, I mean, let me just say, when you're talking to people who might be somewhat strangers or something like that, that the difference between having three people in a room talking or having four people in a room talking is suddenly incredibly different when you have 8 people in a room talking. That essentially the idea, and I think that this is a function of having um, such a low common denominator expectation of propriety, and let's say the cultural standard has fallen so low. And in some sense, I mean, Sam Vaknin talks about how narcissism is increasing and exploding, and it's becoming, let's say, a cultural, um, it's becoming normalized essentially. Um, I think immaturity is being normalized, because I mean, I think in some sense, I mean, you could say that, oh, people, let's say, put on narcissistic visages in order to insulate themselves, because it becomes, it becomes useful way to protect yourself from the narcissism and psychopathy of others by having a sort of a psychotic veneer, a psychopathic veneer, excuse me, um, in order uh, to still be able to participate in this caustic sort of cultural vitriol. Um, and it is very interesting that that kind of kicks in as soon as there is enough of an audience to overpower uh, all the people that, as an individual, is speaking. So even if you're talking in a room with 4 people, if the discussion is essentially a kind of modulated dialogue, 2 people are talking in a group of 4, the exchange between the 2 people, if that's, let's say, the general form of the dialogue, uh, the quality of the exchange between the 2 people, uh, I'm going to do some sort of esoteric mathematics. Anyway, it's an interesting angle. I'm not going to dwell on it. But I think to some extent that is a general, let's say, the low standard of conduct, I think, is a general function of the fact that, I've just blanked. Oh yeah, is a general function of the fact that people are not resilient against um, contending their contradistinctive values against, let's say, the values that are expected as being held by essentially the majority audience or something like that. That the generalization of what the expectation of in the audience is elevated um, in importance, uh, to an extent to which that the individual, let's say, standard and contention is just completely belittled, um, and nihilistically denigrated and sort of sacrificed as a token of sort of sympathetic seduction into the majority rubric, and this kind of abrogation. I mean, again, I keep on making the same point. I guess this is an abrogation of normative values and a normative system of ethics. And it is interesting because it's almost like it's a very sort of spiritual thing, because you have to believe that you have the ability to make an internal locus of control and to make your ideals matter. Um, and I think in some sense this is why people's egos are literally so fragile, because they have no it's layered on top of a hollow uh, platform. There, therefore, the performative role of the ego, um, because the ego is an embodied performance. It is something that you act into being. But essentially, it's not being judged in terms of an internal locus of control. It's being judged in terms of a kind of an external locus of morality, which means that there's no there's no honesty. There's no intellectual honesty, certainly, but there's no fidelity in and this is also where you get overt confabulation, where memory gets reinterpreted in such a specious way, that it, events get recontextualized, so that there's some kind of literal transposition, but it's such a dishonest um, uh, retelling that the kind of the technical, I mean, this is the kind of sophistry that you usually see out of what I would generally classify as cerebral histrionics. Um, but what makes a histrionic different to a borderline is that histrionics have strong egos. I don't mean that they have, not in terms of, I mean, they can't have this fidelity because their unconscious is just completely facile in some sense. But their egos, they want to present a, consistent ego expression. Uh, they want to be tracked. In some sense, they're almost. I think cerebral histrionics and perhaps even histrionics in general. You could make arguments that they're much closer to narcissists than they are to borderlines, um, because in some sense, the histrion, especially the cerebral histrionic, is in some way they're almost like a successful narcissist, because their ego is the consistency in their ego as having a solitary identity that doesn't, like narcissists have sort of shadow egos, or they're just not even there. Yeah, I mean, in some sense, a narcissist, in some sense, just doesn't have an ego whatsoever. But so, I mean, this is why I'm going to have to talk too much about narcissism to make this point. So, okay, I'm not going to leave this point finished, but let me just finish the point that I was going to make. So, people that know what I have to say about narcissism will then be able to follow this. But essentially, um, cerebral histrionics, uh, I think, are delivering the kudos of what would be something like narcissistic supply to their ego. So essentially, their ego is validated by essentially uh, words are failing me, but essentially it's reinforcement. In some, if they can not budge an inch, if they can essentially and this is why it's always fundamentally hollow to talk to these people, because essentially they just want to be right about some arbitrary point. They don't follow the actual purpose of the discussion or the dialogue, or the point in context is completely, they rob everything of context so that they can just kind of make a stand and not have to budge an inch on the stand that they make. And often, they kind of create a false dichotomy around the stand that they make by sort of, using sort of Weasley words and other kind of sophist trickery, in order to kind of precipitate a kind of a gotcha moment or something like that, or some kind of gas, that essentially they are not budging an inch from the stand that they have sort of valiantly sort of narrate themselves as taking within this vacuous relativistic sort of moral context, which is, fundamentally nihilistic in some sense, just so that they can kind of repeat their point and say how it was relevant that they essentially had to reiterate their point. And it's something to do with essentially their consistency in their reiteration proves their, it almost like it isn't, I don't want to get too poetic with these descriptions, but in some sense, it's almost like narcissistic supply that goes the other way. Because in some sense, the problem with the narcissist is that they don't even have an ego, and they're trying to get narcissistic supply from their unconscious. They're trying to get narcissistic supply for their subconscious. Man, I said it wrong twice. It's weird, but in some sense, what a narcissist is trying to do is they are trying to replicate their subconscious within their unconscious. They're trying to, as strong as their subconscious feels, they want their unconscious to be as successful as their subconscious already is. And so the narcissistic supply has to both happen to the unconscious while it's also being delivered to the subconscious. Um, and if it's being delivered to the one, it's not being delivered to the other, and the unconscious kind of needs it more because the subconscious should already be self-satisfied. So it's kind of like an internal war between the unconscious and the subconscious, which is why narcissists go through sort of cyclical, sort of seasonal transitions where they have to kind of let the unconscious have its day in the sun, um, and or if you're a collapsed narcissist or a covert narcissist, then essentially you are completely orientated towards the unconscious side of the mind, which in some sense might also be a the thing that I was about to say is wrong, but let me just say it anyway. But what I'm about to say is wrong, is that you could argue that the collapsed narcissist or the covert narcissist is more developed because at least the unconscious is beyond and above the subconscious, and so it's if you are a covert narcissist, or this is true, what I'm about to say is that if you are a collapsed or covert narcissist for long enough, you will start getting some breadcrumbs of what the ego might look like, but it'll still be a rather destabilized access to the ego. Anyway, what I was going to say is that the cerebral histrionic, in some sense, um, solves all of these problems because, uh, in some sense, they just have a very weak unconscious side of the mind, but essentially the weakness of the unconscious is the strength of the ego, because the ego can essentially recontextualize itself in essentially the recontextualization of the unconscious contribution to the ego, but they have to kind of hide the fact that their morality is just is a game for a kind of pseudo narcissistic supply. But I almost want to call it an inverse narcissistic supply, because it's being showered on the ego from below, rather than narcissistic supply in some sense is something that the subconscious um, is demanding for the unconscious's behalf, which kind of makes the unconscious unable to replicate what the subconscious, the power that the subconscious has. So the unconscious is just sort of in an intrinsically is always subverted. Um, and in some sense, the problem with the narcissist is that they never give the unconscious the keys to the kingdom. They never let the unconscious essentially dominate the subconscious, and so they're kind of stuck in this perpetual childhood of an arrested development. They're Sam Vaknin even speaks about this. They're between the ages of probably, I can't remember the younger ages. I think it's 3 to 4 and maybe 10 years old, that they're sort of within that bracket, and then they never developed any further. Anyway, this has been a long enough recording. So yeah, we are living in a world full of immature, sort of Nazi philosophers in some sense, and that their nihilism is destroying everything, is destroying institutional integrity, but it's generally what is bringing everything down into obscurity, um, and frivolity, but also a very kind of poisonous toxicity, is this lapse in normative values and ethics.